Good morning. Good morning and welcome. Thank you everyone for joining us for the launch of Up for Growth's new and groundbreaking report, Housing Underproduction in the United States. My name is Ali Solis. I'm the board chair for Up for Growth, and I am honored to join this outstanding group of advocates, policymakers, and practitioners today in launching this important research here at the National Press Club. I want to begin by acknowledging our incredible sponsors. Without the support of these amazing partners, this research would not be possible. First, our presenting sponsor, Amazon Housing Equity Fund, and you'll hear more about all of these incredible sponsors when Mike joins us in a minute. Amazon understands that everyone should have access to housing that they can afford, and that low-income and minority families are disproportionately affected by the housing shortage in the United States. We are grateful for their commitment to addressing this issue, and we deeply appreciate their support. The Walton Family Foundation, an old friend of mine, I was just talking to our lead sponsor there that I was in Arizona when it was a sort of crinkle of an idea, so I'm thrilled to have the Walton Family Foundation here with us. They continue to focus on making an impact that improves lives today and for future generations. We are extremely excited to have their support for this work that will help organizations like ours focus time and resources towards achieving vital and important community impact goals. I want to also recognize our advocate sponsors, CBRE Investment Management, Holland Partner Group, the National Association of Realtors, the National Multifamily Housing Council. Thank you so much for your support and ongoing partnership. The research that you will see today is made possible by our supporting sponsors as well, and they are the American Planning Association, Echo Northwest, GBX Group, Habitat for Humanity International, the Leading Builders of America, the Urban Land Institute's Terwilliger Center for Housing, Walker Dunlap, Yardi Matrix, and the Zillow Group. Thank you so much. It is so exciting to have the work of Up for Growth supported by this diverse and committed group of partners. Let's give them all a round of applause. And now it's my pleasure to introduce the CEO of Up for Growth, Mike Kinsella. Mike has worked in the housing community for many, many years. He is our champion. He makes this work happen every day. There are a few people I know who work as tirelessly as Mike does, and we're fortunate to have him leading not only this groundbreaking research, but our organization and carrying forward the vision for Up for Growth towards solving the nation's housing shortage and affordability crisis. Please join me in welcoming Mike.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for the launch of our 2022 Housing Underproduction in the U.S. report. Between 2012 and 2019, housing underproduction in the United States has doubled. The nation has fallen more than 3.8 million homes short of meeting housing needs. 230 metropolitan areas across the country, from rural, urban, everything in between, have failed to produce enough homes that are affordable and accessible to their citizens. Artificial barriers, exclusionary zoning, NIMBYism have combined, making it increasingly difficult for the average American household to afford to live well where they can work, play, and gather. Alone, the consequences and the outcomes of this policy failure on American families warrant intervention, but combined with crumbling municipal infrastructure, combined with racial inequity, combined with a climate crisis growing by the day, this could be catastrophic for families, for cities, entire regions, communities all across the country. And that's why it is so important that each of you are here today, because to create a shared narrative across sectors can help us advance practical, tangible, and tailored solutions to our housing crisis. I'm here today because I believe that housing should always be an opportunity, never an obstacle. And I believe that together we can achieve this vision. This report is the result of over a year of tireless work from a broad team of folks who care deeply about this issue. First, I'd like to recognize Ali Solis, our board chair, who you all met just a moment ago, as well as our entire board of directors and advisory council. And if I know a lot of you are in the room, so please stand up if you're on our advisory council or our board of directors and be recognized. We'd like to also deeply thank the Amazon Housing Equity Fund, Walton Family Foundation, and so many other sponsors for your generous financial support. These 15 organizations represent the leadership and the vision that it will take to truly tackle this challenge. I also want to thank our small but mighty team at Up for Growth, Erica Bateman, Keisha Easley, Barbara Ehimika, Eleanor Green, Anjali Kalachalam, Jenna Turnage, and Omar Joyce, and particularly Omar Joyce for today. Please a round of applause for the team. And our fantastic group of consultants, Sherry Reed, Maria Elena Kempestigi, Lance Hayden, and Mike Wilkerson, who you'll hear from in a bit, and too many others to name. Thank you all. I couldn't ask for a more committed group of pro-housing champions to work alongside. Finally, I'd like to express my deep gratitude to Leah MacArthur. Leah is my chief operating officer, and she was also the co-editor of our report. If you know anything about Leah, you know that she always keeps me on my toes. She never hesitates to challenge my assumptions, and has ensured that this publication communicates the depth of our housing underproduction, but perhaps more importantly, what you can do about it. The report in front of you this morning details how America has fallen 3.8 million homes short of meeting housing needs. But policymakers have choices in how they incentivize or disincentivize housing production. This report and its accompanying policy framework, A Better Foundation, offers a vision for how communities can create more homes in high opportunity neighborhoods, places that are rich with jobs, transportation, infrastructure, and community assets. This morning, we'll hear from Dr. Jared Bernstein, a member of the White House Council of Economic Advisors. In June 2021, Dr. Bernstein and his colleagues wrote, "Exclusionary zoning laws have a profound impact on social welfare because where a family lives matters." Dr. Bernstein will discuss how exclusionary zoning and land use policies have stymied housing production and how this perpetuates racial segregation, creates racial and economic inequities, limits labor mobility, and contributes to the racial wealth gap. He'll also share what the Biden administration plans to do about it by providing American communities the tools that they need to implement policies in alignment with our vision. Next, Nolan Gray, research director with California YIMBY, will lead a fireside chat with Dr. Michael Wilkerson, a partner with economic consulting firm Eco Northwest and the technical lead on our report. Nolan recently published a book entitled Arbitrary Lines: How Zoning Broke the American City and How to Fix It, where he writes that zoning is not a good institution gone bad. Zoning is the mechanism of exclusion designed to inflate property values, slow the pace of new development, segregate by race and class, and enshrine the detached single family home as the exclusive ideal. Mr. Gray and Dr. Wilkerson will discuss why a more of the same approach, as we call it in our report, will not only fail to narrow the gap between the housing we need and the housing we have, but it will worsen the social, economic, and environmental problems we face today. Finally, Dr. Jenny Schutz, author of Fixer Upper, How to Repair America's Broken Housing Systems, will lead a solutions-oriented discussion featuring experts from across sectors. Dr. Carlos Martin of Brookings Metro, Dr. Lynn Kiefer of Freddie Mac, and David Williams of Lafayette Square and formerly Harvard's Opportunity Insights provide forward-thinking ideas to help create more homes while also improving equity, community resilience, and addressing the drivers of climate change. But without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Catherine Buell, Director of the Amazon Housing Fund. Catherine will spend a few moments sharing her perspectives on the value of this research, and then we'll turn it over to Dr. Bernstein. Thank you all for coming today. I hope you enjoy the program.
Well, thank you, Mike. It is so exciting to be here and so exciting to see all of the wonderful progress that Up for Growth has made. It's great to be here representing the Amazon Housing Equity Fund. Supporting the important work that Up for Growth is doing is central to our commitment to creating affordable homes for individuals and families in our hometown communities across the country. The vital research presented here today will help us further understand the scope and the breadth of the challenge before us. As Amazon continues to fund major initiatives, we must have the most up-to-date and rigorous data about the need. As we all know, and we are about to better understand, the housing availability and affordability crisis is growing and unprecedented. Solving it requires engagement of resources in every single person in this room. To that end, the Amazon Housing Equity Fund has committed to providing more than $2 billion to creating or preserving 20,000 affordable homes in our hometown communities, 3 of our hometown communities of the Puget Sound in Washington State, Arlington, Virginia, and DC here in the Capital Region, and Nashville, Tennessee. We've already identified our first 8,000 units in the first year and a half, which is amazing. And I have to give a shout out to our team. David Swift is here representing our team as well. Half of these homes are existing multifamily properties where we've been able to preserve the affordability by providing quick strike funding and making sure that there is long-term affordability commitments. The other half will be new housing supply, and we've been able to create innovative ways in partnership with folks that normally don't come to the table around affordable housing, like our transit agencies, where we've committed over $300 million to creating 3,000 units at or near transit stations in each of our communities. In addition, we've also made a more than $100 million in cash and in-kind donation to our nonprofit partner, Mary's Place, to build the largest family shelter inside an Amazon office building at our Puget Sound headquarters in Washington State. For those who haven't seen Mary's Place, it's a beautiful 200-bed shelter just next to the Spheres in Seattle. As these efforts are underway, we must continue the hard work required to understand and address housing underproduction and the multidimensional challenge that it is. Housing is not just about a roof over your head. It correlates to many other issues we are confronting today, including racial and economic equity, climate change, and building the type of communities that we want to live, work, and raise our children in. No one understands these issues more than our next speaker, Dr. Jared Bernstein. President Biden appointed Dr. Bernstein to the White House Council of Economic Advisors on January 20th, 2021. Before his appointment, he spent 16 years in senior roles at the Economic Policy Institute in the Department of Labor. He was a senior fellow at the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities from 2011 to 2020. And from 2009 to 2011, he was the chief economist and economic advisor to then Vice President Biden. Writing last year about the president's plan, which included $5 billion to incentivize local zoning reform, Dr. Bernstein wrote, "Families who can purchase their own home in the neighborhood of their choice at a fair price and see the value of their home grow over time do better economically in the long run. But numerous policies have systematically discriminated against Black families who wish to pursue that path." As we know, among those policies are exclusionary zoning laws that restrict the types of homes that can be built in a particular neighborhood. So we're pleased to have an expert joining us today who has worked so hard to break down these barriers and create an economy and communities that work for everyone. So please join me in welcoming our keynote speaker, Dr. Jared Bernstein.
Thank you so much. What a great introduction, except you gave half my talk, but that's okay. It was an honor to follow, Catherine. What you just described that you're doing is inspirational, and if the president were here, he'd probably give you a big hug. He's more of a hugger than I am. But I just want to mention that given the amount of commerce that my daughters interact with Amazon, you should consider a plaque with their name on it. We can discuss that later. I want to thank Mike, Omar, Ali Solis and the board for not only writing this important and timely report, but the work that their, quote, small and mighty team did, and the extent to which they punch above their weight is going to be known as the report continues to be disseminated. I'd like to frame my remarks with 5 basic facts that form the backdrop for the Biden housing agenda, all of which are fulsomely highlighted in Up for Growth's excellent and timely report. First, and this is the central problem from which much of the rest of my comments will flow, the supply of housing, owned and rentals, have long lagged the demand. And the word long is key here. It's key to understanding the underproduction. Unlike many of the supply chain snarls that occurred as a result of the pandemic, this one has been over a decade in the making. Second, while the supply-demand misalignment in housing affects home buyers and renters of most income levels, the long-term underproduction is most acute among lower-income parts of the market. Underproduction is the parent of unaffordability and thereby of generational inequality. Third, as is highlighted in the report, getting prices back down to earth, especially in the consumer price index where shelter gets a heavy weight, is highly complementary to boosting housing supply. Facts 4 and 5 flow from the centrality of housing in the economic and social lives of Americans, as Mike and as the report just highlighted. By this I mean we do not achieve our racial equity goals without achieving our housing goals. And I'd say the same thing for our climate goals. Both require an aggressive, muscular policy agenda targeting the underproduction of affordable homes in areas of opportunity with attention to their climate impacts. So the rest of my comments will unpack each of these 5 facts. Beginning with the central challenge of underproduction, you just heard from Mike, so I'm not going to go into the diagnosis. The report provides the facts of the case: 3.8 million units of national underproduction, 169 metro areas experiencing underproduction, and 230 areas experiencing increased underproduction from 2012 to 2019. Now, this concept of underproduction is well chosen. Let me cruise at some 35,000 feet, basic economics here for a minute, and then get more into the weeds. The simple underpinning of market economies is that their inherent incentives are structured to combine natural endowments with existing technology to produce adequate, affordable volumes of what their citizens want and need. Now, that doesn't mean everybody gets to afford caviar and diamonds. Distributional issues are never far away from the surface of this simple construct. But it does mean that basic needs and wants should be met. If you're willing to help bake the pie, you ought to get a fair slice. If someone asked me to describe Bidenomics in one sentence, it would probably be something like that. If you're willing to help bake the pie, you ought to get a fair slice. And yet, when it comes to one of the most basic needs of all, housing, the market has been failing for years. Now, the reasons for this have to do with discriminatory and restrictive land use policies and practices that have prevailed for far too long and our administration has been targeting in ways I'll discuss in a moment. The failure also relates to another long-term development, that of income, and even more relevant in this context, wealth inequality, which combines with too often inaccessible finance sector to exacerbate housing unaffordability. Thus, the key insight from fact number 1, underproduction, is that it is a market failure. And economists of all political stripes agree that where the market fails, there is a role for government intervention. To understand fact 2, that the supply shortfall is most acute for low-income households, we simply need to listen to the affordable housing experts who frequently remind our team that affordable building just doesn't, quote, pencil out. That is, when we look at the incomes and the financing options facing those with incomes below the median, and in many places above the median as well, it is too often the case that builders cannot buy the land, materials, and labor and make an adequate return on their investments to justify building affordable units, whether it's single-family homes or multifamily units. Now, to link these two facts together, all I'm doing here is pointing out that the market failure is one that does not necessarily pervade the whole market, but falls most acutely on those in or about the bottom half. Third, in terms of inflation, shelter gets a weight of 32% in the CPI deflator and about 15 to 20% in the PCE deflator. Now, as the Council of Economic Advisors stressed yesterday in our inflation analysis, this component, that is shelter in the CPI, is now contributing significantly to inflation, and we believe it will continue to do so for some time. As our Twitter thread pointed out in the analysis of yesterday's report, rent and OER, owner equivalent rent, contributed about 28 basis points to the monthly core CPI inflation versus 11 basis points on average pre-pandemic, reflecting changes in the housing market that aren't going away soon. Fourth, perhaps the most important attribute of the Better Foundation plan is that it was crafted to go beyond the status quo, pushing policymakers to, and here I'm quoting from the report, optimize, quote, the distribution of these underproduced homes by prioritizing development in high opportunity neighborhoods, places that are rich in jobs, transportation, infrastructure, and community assets at a density scale to fit into the existing neighborhood while increasing housing options. That is a great aspiration, and it's one that we share on the President's housing team. And let me just pause for a second to point out a couple of my colleagues from the team here, including Aaron Schroyer, my good buddy who organizes many a housing Zoom session that I get to participate in, and my colleague from the CEA, Ryan Cummings. So thank you for all your help on this work. Now, part of achieving this aspiration that I just quoted from the report, it requires attention to a typology that proposes to build more in areas that meet these criteria, but a contribution that I appreciated in this space was the notion of gently, with respect to existing density levels, introducing a more varied mix of housing in high opportunity areas. This is something we talk a lot about on the White House housing team. Fifth, in the same way we understand opportunity in housing to be intimately linked, sustainable climate policy carries the same linkage through building that elevates carbon footprint reduction as a high-level goal. So, I've tried to take you through what I think are the 5 most important facts and unpack them a little bit. And now that we've established the persistence of a lasting market failure and unpacked some of the ideas in the report addressing this consequential failure, let me devote the rest of my remarks to laying out some of the policy tools that the Biden-Harris administration has identified to achieve these goals. For path dependency reasons, and I think this is an important concept, I'm going to come back to it in a moment, exclusionary zoning issues have too often been ignored by the federal government. But the power of the purse and the pen can be mighty, and we've actively been making a run at this critical issue by rewarding jurisdictions for reforms in this space. Now that sounds like a simple idea, the power of the purse and the pen, trying to apply them by rewarding jurisdictions that reform exclusionary zoning. But it's an area that really hasn't seen much activity from the federal government. And when I say we're actively pursuing reforms in this space, I mean there are some that are in the field as we speak, perhaps underappreciated, and much in the spirit of the Up for Growth report. As part of the bipartisan infrastructure law, a bipartisan law that was passed and signed and is now in the field, getting out there, the Department of Transportation released 3 funding applications for competitive grant programs totaling nearly $6 billion in funding that gives jurisdictions, this is the key part, higher scores in the grant process if they feature land use policies to promote density, rural Main Street revitalization, and transit-oriented development. Other Department of Transportation and Department of Commerce economic development programs are adopting this approach as well, and it is embedded in our Unlocking Possibilities proposal that builds on this idea by incentivizing states and localities to eliminate existing exclusionary barriers. This is embryonic work. It's relatively new, and I think there are a lot of housing think tank thinkers in this room, and I very much encourage folks Up for Growth and otherwise to take a close look and evaluation of these measures, because it may be a very, very important key to the future of more equitable housing. The thematic is simple. As long as we're supporting development, let's support it in a way that breaks down affordable housing barriers. In terms of the financing needed to attack the underproduction epidemic, the first thing we should do is think broadly and creatively about the dwellings themselves, being sure to include not just the construction, and this was also in Catherine's comments a second ago, but the preservation and rehabilitation of existing homes, multifamily building, manufactured homes, accessory dwelling units, and 2 to 4 unit properties. So I think a wide range of units is the right target, and the report agrees with me. Our ideas here, many of which require help from Congress, include increasing access to loans that finance both the construction and the mortgage, expansion of the low-income housing tax credit, a proven and impactful tool for providing credits to private investors developing affordable rental housing, and home investment partnership program ideas which provide grants to states and localities that communities can use, very much again in the spirit of the report, to support building, buying, or rehabilitating affordable housing for rent or for ownership. Now, sticking with financing, both we and the independent housing regulators we work with can reduce the cost of lending for manufactured homes, which now tend to carry less favorable terms and rates and shorter maturities. The GSEs are back in the business of promoting safe and secure mortgage financing, and they're examining the feasibility of loan purchases of manufactured housing loans, creating greater liquidity in that market. HUD, Housing and Urban Development, is working along a similar track, making it easier to finance new units and helping manufacturers update their designs to meet changing consumer demands. And I don't get to talk to the president as much as I used to when he was the vice president. I was his chief economist, but we recently talked about these issues, and I was happy to see he was excited about the potential for manufactured housing. The president's 2023 budget includes an ambitious, amply sized signing $25 billion to produce affordable housing. Now, these resources would flow to state and local housing finance agencies and their partners, territories, and tribes with goals that link up closely with the Up for Growth agenda, particularly regarding racial equity and building up the housing supply through multifamily and single-family housing units of modest density. The program will encourage building that targets both local needs and underproduced housing, including intergenerational housing, investments that place vacant or underutilized properties back into productive use, ADUs, accessory dwelling units, and manufactured housing once again. To ensure proper targeting, resources would support renters and home buyers with up to 150% of area median income in high-cost area. These investments, combined with complementary proposals in the budget, would support the development of around 500,000 units of housing over the next decade. Now, much of that is forward-looking policy, programs we're actively fighting for, and many of you are helping and supporting, I know. But before I close, I want to look back and recognize the important contribution the rescue plan made to keeping people in their homes. Another easily overlooked, I think, important component of the president's agenda. When an old Keynesian economist like me thinks about stimulus, relief, or safety net programs, we tend to first think about unemployment insurance, or SNAP, food stamps, or checks to households. These are all essential countercyclical programs, but too often, downturns have led to high levels of foreclosures and evictions. Because President Biden was well aware of this possibility, he made sure robust housing-related supports were in the American Rescue Plan, like the Homeowner Assistance Fund. Other measures, including anti-eviction measures for renters, were initiated at the state level using ARP support, and together they helped to keep foreclosures and evictions below pre-pandemic levels. Such measures have been found particularly important to renters and homeowners of color who were disproportionately affected by the foreclosure crisis in 2007 and 8. Finally, a few words about an important concept that sometimes gets short shrift in housing and many other policy discussions, and that is the concept of path dependency, meaning where we're starting from is a function of how we got to where we are. In housing policy, that decidedly doesn't mean we're forever stuck with the ravages caused by racist exclusionary zoning, or that affordable housing deals can never pencil out because of the skewed distribution of income or the way both the primary and secondary financing markets are constructed. But it does mean that if we want policies like those in the Up for Growth report to come to fruition, we need a roadmap of how to get there. And that roadmap should be sure to start from where we are. And with that, I hope I've convinced you, though I suspect few in this audience need a lot of convincing, that when it comes to housing, the market has long failed to adequately meet the needs of millions of households, many of whom are economically vulnerable, many of whom are persons of color, and many of whom have long, for generations, faced systemic discrimination that has deprived them of the security and opportunity that many of the rest of us take for granted. Well, I'm here to tell you that if you agree with that description of the challenge we face in today's housing markets, then you have many friends in the White House, in which case let us work together to build a better foundation. Thank you. My pleasure.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bernstein, and thank you again for your ongoing work towards building a fair and equitable economy that creates opportunity for all Americans. And now, to, as Dr. Bernstein said, understand where we're coming from before we discuss where we're going and discuss solutions in detail, I would like to introduce Nolan Gray and Dr. Michael Wilkerson. As I mentioned earlier, Nolan is the research director for California YIMBY. He currently is completing a PhD in urban planning at the University of California, Los Angeles, and previously worked as a planner in New York City. He's a widely published author, and his most recent book, Arbitrary Lines, How Zoning Broke the American City and How to Fix It, it was released just last month by Island Press. Also joining us today is Dr. Michael Wilkerson, partner and director of analytics at Eco Northwest. He brings over 15 years of private sector experience as an economic consultant and analyst in the financial services industry. Mike studies urban economics for both public and private sector clients with a focus on land use, transportation, real estate development, and how they interact with regional economies. Mike is also an adjunct professor at Portland State University, my alma mater. We are very fortunate to have both of these experts with us today to present the detailed findings of our Housing Underproduction report and why a real change in the status quo is required if we're going to truly solve the housing crisis. Please join me in giving them a warm welcome. Come on up to the stage, Mike and Nolan.
How's everybody doing? It's good to be here. It's good to be from California, where we've solved all these issues. Mike, of course, he was so, Los Angeles is so affordable and the housing's so abundant, called me in to teach the East Coasters here some lessons. So, but in all seriousness, it's great to be here. As somebody who thinks about this stuff all day, every day, the report is incredible and just really rich with interesting findings. And it's great to be here with Mike, who of course played a huge role in the report. I want to start with something I think conceptual, but actually really important. What do you all mean by underproduction?
That's a dense question right out of the gate. Hopefully everyone is appropriately caffeinated here as we dive into a 25-minute session on some of the details. I think before answering the question, I'd be remiss to not again thank the sponsors of this report. Truly, without their support, we cannot do these type of deep dive investigations. As Mike Kinsella mentioned, over a year spent on this, a lot of resources, and it was a true pleasure to collaborate with the Up for Growth team, led by Ali and the board, as well as staff, where they really were very helpful in providing a research brief that said, create something that is actionable, transparent, and repeatable. And that was our charge, and from the very beginning, we engaged a very helpful and willing group of advisors. I have a list here because I'll probably forget someone if I don't, but starting with the Urban Institute, the National Multifamily Housing Council, National Association of Realtors, Freddie Mac, American Enterprise Institute, Joint Center at Harvard, Turner Center at Berkeley, Mercatus Center at George Mason, and the George W. Bush Center at SMU. So many of you are in the room, so thank you very much for helping us iterate this process so that we could truly provide a lens into housing and housing underproduction, that the depth of which I don't think has been done before. And so to get back to your question, why not housing shortage? This is the term, I think, prior to 2017 that was ubiquitously used everywhere. We have a housing shortage. And if we break out our economics principles textbooks, that word is in there regularly.
You
and
can
I think
break them out now if you have them.
Yeah. If you haven't sold them after the class, as most do. I think the challenge is it's a little bit of splitting hairs. But really, when we get at the technical definition of a shortage, it implies at a specific price that the market is not supplying the needed number of units. And I think an applicable, very relevant concept for a shortage is, as Dr. Bernstein was mentioning, is affordable housing. So affordable housing needs to be delivered at a specific price, typically 60% or less of area median incomes. And the market for years consistently has not done that to the tune of millions of housing units short. That's a shortage. Why does that not apply broadly to the market? I think really we're trying to allude to something where there's an interactive effect. And what happens from systemic underbuilding over at more than a decade is that feedback loop to where prices continue to increase when we don't build enough housing. And so by coming up with a different term around underproduction, I think it really helps laser focus the solution as well as the problem. The problem is we don't have enough housing, and the solution is we need to build more. So calling it housing underproduction, I think, is a helpful differentiator there. And again, it's a little bit of splitting hairs, but I think it really helped Brandon differentiate this body of work that we've now been doing for the past 5 years or so.
Mm-hmm. Well, now that we've warmed them up with the conceptual stuff, I want to jump into some of the main findings here. So, I mean, when I first started thinking a lot about this issue and doing work with the great people at the Mercatus Center, we would talk to people, I think, in a lot of contexts where historically they don't think they have a housing issue, right? You would talk to policymakers in a state like Utah or a state like Tennessee, and they'd be like, well, that's a California problem. Now they're, those same people, of course, are calling us up and are like, what's going on, right? But I want to kind of jump into what you all broadly found. I mean, so we have the housing underproduction by state here. What surprised you?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing that stands out certainly is the fact that it's pernicious almost everywhere. It's in 47 states, and as Mike Kinsella and Dr. Bernstein and many others have mentioned, this is a growing problem. If we go back to 2012, 1.7 million units, growing to 3.8 million units. And during that time period, every year, underproduction has worsened, which is to say the need for more units has increased every year since 2012. That's the bad news. Try to not always be a wet blanket as an economist. There is, if you will, a little bit of good news in there in that from 2018 to 2019, because we're able to replicate this methodology year over year, was the smallest increase, right? So in terms of, we're talking second derivatives here, things that nobody wants to talk about, but that is a benefit, decreasing the rate of increase. And more importantly, 24 states actually improved underproduction from 2018 to 2019. So in aggregate, yes, it is still getting worse, but there are many places on this map, 24 of those states, that are making improvements. And so that's the good news. What 2020, 21, et cetera, we know we're unprecedented times, and when the data are available, we'll kind of see how that shakes out. But what you don't see on the map is the specificity of what we are looking at. And so here, the question really was around, how do you analyze housing markets? And I think, as everyone is aware, housing markets aren't statewide issues, right? Parts of one state are largely independent from other parts of the state. So we really wanted to get geographically specific. So to do that, we created metro regions, of which there are roughly 300, and non-metro regions, of which there are roughly 500. And so with those 800 regions across the country, we can investigate underproduction within each of them, and then we can roll that up to the state level. And so places that in states that don't have underproduction, that's great. But the places that do have underproduction, we want to be able to understand where that is and look at the trends and what that is telling us. And so when we look at the map, what we don't see, for example, is the 230 metro areas where underproduction has worsened from 2012 to 2019. You just see the numbers. So I think that the trend is really, really the key here. And so, there are a variety of typologies in the report that we kind of discuss. Places where they didn't have underproduction. So take example, Phoenix did not have underproduction in 2012. Now is short more than 100,000 units. Other places had underproduction and it worsened, places like Washington, D.C. So there's a variety of typologies that we can look at and understand really what's happening on the ground with a much more fine-grained level of detail than at the state level.
I mean, yeah, I think the metropolitan analysis is super important. I mean, housing is kind of a weird issue, right? It seems overwhelmingly the regulation happens at a very local level based on, to use a word, arbitrary lines, right, of these municipal, buy my book, please.
Is that trademark?
Island Press asked me to say arbitrary at least 3 times in this talk. So, but I mean, we do it at a local level, and then a lot of this analysis is at the state level, but I think that was a huge, important step forward with this report. I think another thing that really stood out to me was the different trends in housing underproduction, right? So I think this is, again, I think where the narratives have maybe been shaped by a handful of places. Like you think of maybe a place like Los Angeles or New York City, and you're like, well, yeah, the problem there is, we're just not building enough housing. But the nature of the underproduction problem, I think, actually varies. You guys talk about 3 trends in this report.
Yeah, that's right. And so there is a formula in the report, but again, we're not going to get into the weeds of the math, but it is in there. And I think the important part is we can really identify specific unique characteristics that are happening in different markets. And so to do that, I think the first step that we did in this process is recognize that really what we're interested in is units that can be occupied by owners or renters. And so when we look at an entire stock of housing, there are units that are second in vacation homes. Roughly 4% of the entire stock of the US are second in vacation homes. And so when you remove those, now you're really getting at a true kind of apples to apples of how many units are there, what are those characteristics. And so the drivers of the underproduction, we really boil down to kind of 3 different categories. Insufficient availability, and that's, I think, the thing that most people think of. What does that mean? In its most simple form, you just look at the number of housing units relative to the number of households. And from there, you're going to get a ratio. That ratio nationally is 1.14. You take out second vacation homes, it's 1.1. Why? Well, we have a structural vacancy factor, right? We don't expect that we're going to have a market that perfectly has 1 unit for every household. And so in the report, we kind of provide a rationale for how many units you should have, and that's that insufficient availability. A second category of homes that is, I think, an important part of the stock, but certainly not occupiable by tenants or owners, is what we describe as uninhabitable units. So census has definitions of problems associated with the housing stock. Here we really focus on 2 of those categories. It's places that lack indoor plumbing and a complete kitchen. So both of those factors. And so when you look at that stock of housing, there are roughly 2 million units that meet that criteria across the country. The vast majority of those units are vacant, I think for self-explanatory reasons, right? Difficult to occupy a unit that doesn't have indoor plumbing and a kitchen. And so again, we want to take those units out of the stock. And so for example, when we look at these 3 places, Detroit being the most prominent place where 30% of underproduction is really due to these uninhabitable units, and it kind of points to a policy solution. We don't necessarily need to build more units, but there are rehabilitation, adaptive reuse, and other options that could help fill that gap. And that's a very different problem than insufficient availability, where there just aren't enough units. I think the last piece, which is growing and probably one of the largest contributing factors to underproduction, certainly in the known places like California, are what we call missing households. And what is a missing household? A missing household is really that interactive effect or endogenous effect of when housing isn't affordable and isn't available, people simply don't form households. For those of you who have children over the age of 18 who might be living at home, you're not alone. This is the highest percentage in US history of people over the age of 18 living at home. And those people typically would form households. And so when they don't form households, or people are continuing to roommate into later years than they have traditionally, we can basically calculate that difference of households that haven't formed, largely due to the lack of availability of housing, and that's that third component is missing households. So when you look at a place like Washington, D.C., more than half of the underproduction falls into that missing households category. And so that lens can again be applied to all 800 regions that we have across the country and look at specifically and diagnose what's happening, and that can lend some, I think, guidance to policymakers in terms of the types of interventions that might be most effective.
Yeah, I mean, the missing households piece, I think, is really important because it's kind of a wonky element to this issue, but households that simply never form, right? I mean, another sort of related finding to this is delayed fertility in markets where housing is expensive. One of the things about kids is that they take up space. And if that space is expensive, right, you either maybe you don't have kids that you would have wanted to have, or you delay it. So that's, I think, a really subtle and important point. Another, I think, interesting sort of conceptual element of this report that I thought was really thoughtful was this this way that we think about, we sort of have 2 buckets of cities. We have expansive cities and expensive cities, and to a certain extent, I think you guys make the case that that's a false dichotomy or something that we can move beyond that. Do you want to unpack that?
Yeah, absolutely. So a few years ago, researcher Izzy Romem produced a study through 2010. And he looked at the top 50 metro areas in the country and looked at how much the geographic area for which housing existed in a metro. There's some minimum density threshold. That's that horizontal axis, is the expansiveness of that. And then he looked at how much prices had increased. And from the period up through 2010 in his report, he really found kind of 3 clusters, legacy cities that weren't growing. But for cities that were growing, they typically fell into 2 paths, expansive and expansive or expensive. And I think the question is, I don't think, well, at least publicly, cities opt into we want to be an expensive place. But as you're well aware, implicitly through their policy selections, they are in effect doing that. When you restrict the area for which you can build, what you effectively do, and the data showed this through 2010, is those places that didn't expand geographically, and whether that's natural barriers or regulatory barriers that aren't able to expand or didn't expand, they were the places that increased the most. So when you look at the chart, through 2010, you can really see places like Portland, Seattle, Denver, Salt Lake, as places that many of them have growth management practices and or are geographically limited in terms of the scale of which, and they expanded basically vertically, which means got more expensive while not growing spatially. And then you have the expansive places. And here they typically do make an intentional choice. The intentional choice is, let's try to not limit housing. And through 2010 at least, places like Boise, Raleigh, Las Vegas, Austin, and there are many others in that category, were able to curtail price increases while basically expanding. And that typology, I think, held and resonated at least through 2010. Through 2020, though, what we've seen is, unfortunately, that didn't work. Effectively, these places, and that's the last chart with the little rocket ship tails, shot straight up. So they stopped moving out at the rate that they did, and they started moving up, which is indicative of still expanding, but prices were going up to where Boise, for example, in the last year or 2 years is one of the most rapidly growing places, and that rapid growth in prices has caught up to places like Denver, Portland, Seattle. So while they were once able to grow indefinitely, effectively, there becomes a limit to that growth, to that strategy. And most of these places that were adopting that strategy, intentionally or otherwise, now face a different dilemma, which is, can you continue doing that in the future? And I think the answer is no. And so this is where a better foundation really, I think, is a useful framework for an alternative. And that alternative really is about breaking down historic barriers, and there's a myriad of benefits associated with that that are in the report, that are in there, that we can certainly unpack some more. But that's really the impetus behind why that framework was created and included along with the housing underproduction.
Yeah, I mean, it strikes me that there's maybe two levels going on here, right? There's the expansive in the sense of a city like Boise or Austin is just spreading outward, right? And it strikes me that, I mean, at a national level too, I think what you're seeing a lot of population migration associated with this, right? So, I mean, the household moving to a place like Phoenix and Boise, where the crisis has become just probably most acute over the last 5 years, they're priced out of like that's downstream of another housing crisis, and there was that was low-hanging fruit, right, a couple years ago, but that's been picked, and I think that's why we're seeing, for example, I think last year in 2021, the fastest home price appreciation in America was in Tampa, not historically the place that you think of, housing affordability issues. I want to talk about some of the effects of this. So, of course, one of the main reasons that we talk about housing underproduction is the affordability component here. Of course, this is, I think, top-line finding is a lot of this stuff has gotten significantly worse since 2012. But what did you all find, and maybe what's not finding its way enough into the typical narrative?
Yeah, so I think, high level, it's a surprise to no one that the affordability crisis has been a decade or more in the making. And I think the public awareness of this is growing. And so a recent survey, I think in late 2021, found that 49% of Americans found that availability and affordability of land is a problem in their community. Now, that maybe doesn't sound like, okay, 50%, but that's up 10% from only 3 years before. I think what's more telling is at that same point, again, this is in late 2021, relative to issues like crime or drug addiction or the economic and health effects related to the COVID pandemic, housing was the #1 issue over any of those. And so again, this is becoming much more of a nationwide problem. And so one of the ways that we can start to understand, what are the kind of cause and downstream effects of this, and Dr. Bernstein with path dependency really helped tee this concept up. Here we can look at, and again, every economist loves scatter plots. Is this causation? Absolutely not causation. But what it's showing is that there's a relationship between the places that had the most underproduction as a share of their housing stock, so that's that horizontal axis. Places like many parts of California, Bend, Oregon, amongst those that are 10% or more of their housing stock is the equivalent of what the underproduction looks like, versus how much their prices increased from 2012 to 2019. And so what you find is the places that have the most underproduction also had the highest price increases. So this is really that kind of downstream effects of when you don't build enough housing, right? The implication is prices go up.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, this is a great another great graphic here from the report. The share of cost burden renter households. I mean, you made a point there which I thought was interesting, which is this is sort of becoming a top issue, right? And I think historically it wasn't one of these top issues that got discussed, and then of course it becomes a major. You can read editorials about this just about every day in every major newspaper, and presidential candidates have opinions on zoning. I mean, it's been a complete sea change. It really hit me. I'm originally from Lexington, Kentucky, and it really hit me. I was talking to my parents, and they were really, really excited. I called them, and they were telling me there was a house for sale on their block, and there was a line of what were going to be bidders on that property around the block. And of course, I think their natural reaction to it as homeowners was like, this is awesome. And of course, the home sold within 24 hours, 20% above asking price. But I think this is something that I think is an enduring theme in the report, and some of the great research you all have done is just this is, number one, becoming a major issue, but it's also just becoming, it's spreading where people are thinking about this. I mean, Lexington is the type of city where like the Chamber of Commerce puts up a banner bragging about low apartment rents, right, on the main street. And now it's a city where they're having these almost California-style discussions, which is interesting. We have about 4 minutes left, but we're going to take questions. So there are note cards and pens at every table. If you fill that out and maybe just raise it, someone from the team will come by and get those from you. I want to talk about, in these last few minutes, I want to talk about some of the variation among different populations. Housing affects different groups, different Americans in different ways. So, what's the top line finding there?
Yeah, again, I think surprise to no one, this has risen in awareness, and I think the report goes into great detail in looking at the impacts, particularly for communities of color. What we know, very quickly to touch on this, is the status quo is broken, right? Mm-hmm. We know what's going to happen. Predictably, the status quo is going to produce inequitable outcomes. Like, this is now, I think, very known and understood. And there are many reasons for that. And we start to unpack some of them in the report. But for example, redlining a practice from the late 20s and 30s, those effects still persist today. And when we look in cities, the areas that were redlined are still predominantly the places that you see multifamily housing. And the opposite point of that is these exclusionary neighborhoods are still effectively excluding people today. Even though the discriminatory racist covenants are long gone, the Hulk mapping is long gone, many decades on later, we still see the long-term effects of that through that institutionalized zoning, as you point out. And so what that does is perpetuate these kind of inequities. So homeownership rates being one of them. Here, this chart is, I think, showing effectively the gains in or change in homeownership rate going back to the 1970s. And when you look at black households, the rate is effectively unchanged. Latino and white households have grown, and Asian households have grown the most. But what this rate of change doesn't mask is the fact that Latinos are still well below the white homeownership rate. And so that homeownership rate, why does that matter? Well, I think when you look at the wealth inequity, homeownership is typically, for most households, certainly of low and moderate incomes, the largest component of wealth. And so for households that can't access homeownership, that's really that preventing mechanism. And so again, in a better foundation, I think really this is about breaking down exclusionary barriers and providing pathways to deliver a different type of housing. And that different type of housing looks different, in it's getting built in places where maybe building hasn't happened in decades, that are high opportunity areas, adjacent to transit, in jobs-rich places that have high economic mobility, as measured by some of the research out of Opportunity Insights. And crucially, that they're building a different type of housing. So the location is different and what's building is different. So instead of building detached housing, the framework is suggesting building housing that is attached, whether that's missing middle, medium density, or even high density where appropriate in neighborhoods. And so that changing dynamic is really opens up opportunities for ownership and or for rents that are not cost burdening people to the extent that they have historically. And what the report shows nationally is, on average, if you built those 3.8 million units, those households would save about $3,000 using this better foundation versus a more of the same kind of continuation of the status quo, which is predominantly detached housing.
Well, I think 2 points on this, and then bring it back to an LA context. One, you really see the impact on Hispanic households because, in a place like Los Angeles, it's very easy for people to say, like, oh, Los Angeles is expensive, just don't move there. A lot of people are born in Los Angeles, actually. I don't know if you guys know this. And some of them might like to stay, right? And, of course, the demographics of the city have changed quite a lot, and really, the Hispanic American population in LA doesn't actually, in many cases, those households don't have a path to homeownership in the city that they're from, where their social networks are. And you're seeing growth in adjacent states for part of this reason. We're kind of doing a good cop, bad cop situation with these panels. We're kind of, Mike and I were asked to talk about some of the problems. So if you're feeling down, just stick around. The next panel, we'll be talking about some of the really exciting solutions. It's one of the most solvable major problems, I think, facing the country today. But so do we want to go ahead and take some questions? Do we collect any note cards?
So I will start with the first question. How does the increase in underproduction since 2010 or so compare to production over the same period? I.e., do we need 10% more construction, 20%, et cetera?
Yeah, that's a great question. So in the report, we look at a 20-year production period. Why? Well, certainly you can't build 3.8 million units in 1 year. And I think the question is, how much can you build? And what we effectively get at through that is a ramping up period. And what that ramping up period does is allow for policy alignment, incentive policies, and I think crucially, scalability of the building trades. When you look at labor rates today, they're increasing, and that's not because there's an abundance of construction workers out there. In fact, I think when you look nationally, there's about the same number today as there was at the peak of the last cycle. And so the question is, how much more production could you reasonably do? In the report, I think 20 years sounds like a long time for 3.8 million units, but when you look at that incremental amount, it would be more than doubling the production rate that you're seeing today. It would be about 25% more than doubling, in fact. And so, based on the historic run rate of what we're doing, this is no small feat. I think, identifying the problem, right, as this report is doing a really great job of. And now the challenge is, what are those most impactful things that can be done in short order to help take this known problem and start whittling away at it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think there's another element of it too that sort of gets left behind is the economic, sort of the money that's being left on the table in terms of just, these are good, construction used to be, a huge source of high-paying, high-quality blue-collar jobs that form the basis for opportunity in many communities, and we've kind of left that on the table, right? I mean, I think we sometimes urbanists have a maybe like eat your vegetables approach to this, like, yeah, unfortunately we're going to have to build a bunch of housing. I'm sorry, but there's a whole bunch of other spin-off benefits to this, right? That I think sort of get left out.
So we have another question. We have probably more than we'll be able to get to, but 2012 was a period of low demand because of the recession. How does that impact the findings? So why would you pick 2012 to 2019 instead of, say, 2009 to 2019?
Great question. As is usually the case, data limitations really impacted what we wanted to do here. The main impact is the shapes that we use in the study, these metro regions, changed in 2012. So usually after the census, there's a couple-year lag and they changed. I think 2012, though, shed some light into the fact that even at that atypical market condition, we still started from a basis of a deficit underproduction and grew from there. And so I think the goal going forward is to then replicate this every year so we can really start to track this on an annual basis. And so yes, absolutely would have been great to be able to go back to 2000. Is that possible to do at some point? Possibly is that case, but I think for here we really wanted to just establish an initial baseline through this cycle at a minimum and be able to track that on a go-forward basis.
And the good news is there'll be nothing funny with the 2020 data.
Nothing funny whatsoever.
It'll start to look normal.
Nothing happened, right, in the last 2 years?
Not to my knowledge, no. Yeah. Housing got more expensive, I think. Yeah.
The next question, what does the report say about community land trusts or long-term affordability?
Yeah, so I mean, I think the next panel is well-equipped to get into kind of policy solutions. The report itself, I think, has a very light touch in terms of options to deliver affordability. Community land trusts, I think, are a known, massively underutilized opportunity. But maybe I'll defer to either Nolan or the next panel in terms of how applicable that might be as a tool.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question, and the next panel will cover it. But I would just say, we need an all-of-the-above approach to this issue. There's shortages at basically every income level. And so you absolutely do need to be making sure that you're having dedicated, deed-restricted, affordable supply, and you need market rate as well.
Okay, waiting for the green dot. We have a couple of questions about how we accounted for missing households. In particular, how or if we are able to account for people that are choosing, maybe for cultural reasons, or others by choice living in multi-generational homes. If the data can account for co-ops or other home sharing agreements. And then part two of that is are missing households a symptom or a cause? They would like to understand a little better how you can address missing households by increasing production.
Yeah, so let me take the technical question first. I think here, in consultation with many of the research advisors, we leaned heavily on some of the research that Freddie Mac had done before. And really the idea here is to establish, and we're going to get into a few technical terms, apologies, headship rates. So headship rates really look at the number of people that are heading households. And we can look at these trends historically over time. And where we see deviations of headship rates at specific age groups is really how we're counting these missing households. So does it account for things like multi-generational or co-ops? It doesn't. So I think it's not a perfect measure. Nothing when you're doing these kind of studies is a perfect measure, but I think it's a good enough proxy and indicative of that growing need for different types of housing. And is it a symptom or a cause? And it's both, right? That's what endogenous means at its heart, right? It's both responsive to the fact that housing is not affordable and available, so households don't form. Because they don't form, they're contributing to that latent demand as well, because they are looking for housing, maybe, they just can't afford it, and so that's kind of should be included as part of that.
The next question is, can you talk about the implications for Latino home ownership?
Yeah, I mean, as Nolan mentioned before, and I think there's a great guest author piece in there that really gets into this. Of the top 10 underproduced metros, I think 9 out of those 10 were majority Latino communities. So there is a strong relationship between the places that are underproducing and the fastest growing race and ethnicity and demographic groups across the country. And that's again not a quick fix, right? This is the result of many decades of discriminatory policies in place, and because of the fast growth of that demographic group, and the mortgage readiness is a term I think that it's in there of that group. There's really a lot of potential for homeownership opportunities. The question is, can you provide housing that aligns with those preferences locationally and from an affordability standpoint?
Well, and I think something that you find in the data too is that these households face pressure on both ends, right? They don't have a path to homeownership, and then of course rent burdens are highest in many Latino majority counties or jurisdictions. So you're kind of between a rock and a hard place here for many of these households. Not only are we not building maybe those small lot single family homes or townhouses or condos that could have given many Latino households a path to homeownership, but also we're not building the multifamily rental stock that makes it manageable to remain a renter, even if you're not maybe building equity.
Another question about the data. Many usually think of underproduction as something consumers are the final arbiter of, and consumers tell us where there's underproduction by bidding up prices and rents. Can you help us understand intuitively how Texas can possibly rank above New York, New Jersey, Connecticut on underproduction? Where are the high prices?
Yeah, so again, the rank I think can be misleading because Texas is, as Nolan said, lots of people live in Texas, right? It's a big state. And so when you look at the component parts of Texas, there are lots of major metro areas in Texas. I don't have this definitively. My sense is more than any other state. And so when you have all these metro places, those are the places that you typically see the bulk of the underproduction. In non-metro regions in the country, there is underproduction, and that's growing. But inside the metro areas, that's really the case. And so places like Austin, Dallas, San Antonio, Houston really are, in the last decade, growing very quickly in terms of underproduction versus I think the perception of a decade or more ago was, there's no issue in Texas. And so this is, I think, one of the main implications of the report, and particularly when you look at missing households, that's that driving, one of the driving factors in Texas is that endogenous factor.
Did you consider impacts of disasters, either damaged from past events or uninsurability in your analysis?
We certainly talked about it a lot. I think it's a very relevant part of, let's say, a framework like a better foundation of understanding climate change, risk, natural disasters, those types of things. But in terms of a specific part of the report, no, it's not directly mentioned. we tried to avoid boiling the ocean. I don't know if we succeeded. There's a lot in there, but that was one of the things that unfortunately we didn't tackle.
How does private equity's role in housing production impact housing affordability? While they can help increase housing supply, is their role in housing development lowering housing costs for renters?
You want to take that one?
I mean, can I just say yes?
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah, yes. I'm sorry, no smart answer there.
What is the relationship of quality to quantity, i.e. home type, neighborhood context?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I think part of this report was going beyond just the math behind creating underproduction, and really starting to unpack more of the same, or what the status quo is doing, and those barriers, and how they're so path dependent, and entrenched interests are really dug in around many of those issues. And a better foundation, I think, really gets at these questions around what are those amenities that people value locationally? Is it access to transit? Is it walkability? Is it proximity to jobs? And all of those things translate ultimately into benefits, not only to that individual, but I think widespread societal benefits, particularly when we think about climate. And so this kind of, value perception, what you're building really is at the heart of, I think, not only the problem, but also the solution.
Yeah, I mean, I think a related point here is, we talk a lot in terms of units, right? Like in the abstract, but a house isn't a house, right? There's of course a geographical element of it, which is really important. Even within metro areas, we're probably building not nearly enough housing in the specific neighborhoods that people want to be, high opportunity neighborhoods. And so, I think as I'll talk about in the next panel, you don't want a solution that solves that unit problem by just putting a whole bunch of housing out on the periphery that might be an hour and a half away from jobs. And then, of course, yeah, quality. I mean, housing quality, this is kind of another complicated element in sort of distilling what's going on. But of course, one of the great things about new housing is that it's nice. And you realize that when you live in a 1950s dingbat in LA. But, I mean, in all seriousness, right, I think this is something that that sort of gets left behind, right? It's not just about, we need to build X number of units. There needs to be a serious conversation about housing quality and where the units are being built.
And this is the last question. For the uninhabitable units, the factors are based on indoor plumbing and incomplete kitchens. What other factors would you consider? Would environmental issues and health quality be considered?
Well, we have 10 seconds. The simple answer is, unfortunately, in terms of wide data availability, those are really the limiting factors and what's available at the census. But there are certainly many other factors I think would be appropriate to consider. It's just data availability really was the guiding principle there.
Yeah. Well, that's all the time we have. Thanks for all the intelligent questions. Mike and I will be floating around, and thank you to Up for Growth for helping to put this together.
Thank you. Thank you, Nolan, and thank you, Mike, for a thoughtful presentation on the report and the problem that we're facing as a nation. I've been asked to stall for a couple minutes while a couple extra chairs get up here, so I'm just going to, reflect on a couple questions that we got from the audience. I think dealing with climate and resilience and thinking about wildland-urban interface issues or areas prone to storm damage along the coastline. We also heard questions about the matching of product type to consumer demand, housing quality, and these are all issues that a better foundation aims to get at, which is to say a better foundation really considers three component parts. One, mapping opportunity. Where would we want to build more homes in order to optimize for equity, affordability, getting at these systemic barriers that we discussed earlier today, but also optimizing for climate resilience, adaptation, and better economic and fiscal outcomes. And so our Better Foundation approach really gets at that matching issue around product type, and housing quality, and we're going to talk more about that in our panel discussion on solutions. So next, as we move to our panel discussion, it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Jenny Schuetz. Dr. Schuetz is a senior fellow at Brookings Metro and an expert in urban economics and housing policy. I've known her for several years. She's written numerous peer-reviewed journal articles on land use regulation, housing prices, urban amenities, and neighborhood change. She and her work has been featured in a wide variety of national publications, from the New York Times to PBS NewsHour. Dr. Schuetz earned a PhD in public policy from Harvard University and a master's from MIT in city planning. She also has a bachelor's degree with the highest distinction in economics and political and social thought from the University of Virginia. And as I mentioned earlier, she is the author of Fixer Upper: How to Repair America's Broken Housing Systems. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Jenny Schuetz.
Thanks, Mike. And I am going to go ahead and do very quick introductions of our three panelists today. Their full bios are in your handouts. So I'm joined immediately to my left by Carlos Martin, my colleague from Brookings Metro, all the way down the hall. Next to him is Len Kiefer. Len works as a deputy chief economist at Freddie Mac. And at the end, we have David Williams, who is recently at Lafayette Square and previously was at the Opportunity Insights Project at Harvard. So we are tasked with finding solutions to all of the problems and having an upbeat tone. We'll get to the solutions, I promise, but we're going to start by unpacking some of the implications that we haven't gone into in as much detail. So Carlos, I'd like to start with you. One thing when we look at the map, there's this sort of spreading of the problem, right? This is not just a big coastal cities. We're seeing more and more places that are underproducing housing. And so one reaction to that map might be to say, every place needs more housing. We should just build as much housing as we possibly can anywhere there's land and availability. You focus particularly on climate implications. Are there places where we shouldn't be building housing?
Well, it certainly matters where we build. That's absolutely critical. And I mean, if you look at the history of human settlements on this planet, it's places that are environmentally viable to live in. And so I would say that, future climate scenarios are no different. They're going to dictate where places that are more amenable, more viable for development should occur. So at the risk of offending this crowd, some zoning, some restrictions are good. We need to limit development in certain areas and encourage. So I'm bringing you back into into your good graces. Those places that are more amenable to development should be maximized then, to encourage the growth that needs to happen.
So build enough housing in the places that are climate safe and less housing in places that are climate risky.
That's a good way of putting it. I would put two more caveats on that. One is that it's important to realize that I use the terms more amenable, more viable, and not right or wrong, mainly because there is no perfect place on this planet to live. I get calls all the time from reporters saying, where should I live in America? That's not going to have a climate effect. Sorry, that's not going to happen. Every place on this planet is going to have a climate effect. So it's, and I'm particularly concerned when I see, early studies that happen in Florida, for example, saying, well, you shouldn't live in coastal Florida because sea level rise is going to increase flooding. You should move inland. Well, guess what? Inland, there are just as many homes at the same level of exposure to wildfires in Florida. So we have to be a little conscious about sort of making sure we're nuanced about the environmental implications about where we're going. So that's on the environment. On the social side, the disclaimer I would say is you can't go into a community that currently exists and say you are a wrong place to live. I recall right after Hurricane Katrina, public officials from state and federal agencies going into Lower Ninth and to East New Orleans telling people you should not exist anymore. We have to be a little more nuanced. So I would say let's talk about where is more amenable and where we can maximize development.
Len, we haven't amazingly talked about work from home and what that's done for the demand for housing. Can't believe we've gotten this far into it without bringing it up. But one of the things that we see, again, this sort of shift from this is a problem just in the expensive coastal cities, this is more of a problem now in Salt Lake and Boise. Many of these are places where we have seen growing demand during the last 2 years. What does work from home do to the demand for housing in terms of the kinds of space, where people want to live, the kinds of structures? How does that overlay with our underproduction map?
Yeah, this report is incredibly important in highlighting this sort of broad spectrum where the housing underproduction is, across the country. And since 2020, right, the last couple of years, we've seen just the acuteness of this housing underproduction show up across markets across the country, with house prices escalating supercharged after the pandemic. There's two kind of main factors that have contributed to that. Sort of in the context of this massive underproduction of housing, you have a tremendous shift in demand that was a result of the pandemic and the rise of remote work. Some economists at the Fed have attributed up to half of the increase in home prices since 2020 was due to the remote work and the shift, spatial relocation of people. And at Freddie, we've looked at sort of research, recently around how people have been moving and how that has, put the acute pressure on even more markets. And finding solutions is incredibly important there, because what's happening is you're seeing folks leaving some of those higher cost areas. One of the things that the report highlight, right, you see sort of the California shortage, the Texas shortage. Well, those folks responding to that, responding to the higher prices, responding to higher rents, have started to move, looking for lower cost. And because of the remote work options for many Americans, they're able to take advantage of that. But then that puts additional pressure on those. And to Carlos's point, they may be moving into places where there are additional hazard risks, and they're exposing themselves to things. But because the demand is so strong and the sort of supply issue is so tough in many of those other markets, they move that way. And so that creates a really tough environment from a policy perspective to think about how we're going to do, what are the solutions. But it's no doubt that you're seeing people responding, right? They respond to these higher rents, they respond to these higher prices, and if they have opportunities now that were not open, pre-pandemic, they're taking advantage of them, and then the result is what we see happening in the housing market and creating, a lot of the dislocations that we're seeing over the last couple of years.
Yeah. And it's notable, the data in the report goes through 2019. So the underproduction that we're seeing is before work from home kicks in. Would we expect this to have gotten worse in the last 2 years if we do this?
Yeah, absolutely. You think about the missing households. Some of them have started to show up despite all of these costs, right? And some interesting analysis that folks at the Federal Reserve have Fed notes looking at sort of what happened throughout the pandemic. And what initially happened was many households actually contracted a bit as folks that were young adults often moved back home with parents. Then they moved back out and formed new households. But what they found is that instead of they were roommates, in a roommate situation perhaps, or shared living arrangement, they went out and formed independent households. And so that doubles the number of effective households and creates that much more pressure on prices and rent. So there's no doubt that since the last 2 years, these pressures are only building, and looking at the demographic profile, they're only going to build for the next 3 to 5 years as we sort of move through this big increase of young adults throughout the American population.
David, we've started to get into some of the equity implications, but I want you to tell us a little bit more about this, right? Sort of housing underproduction at the state level doesn't necessarily tell you about spatial patterns of where people live within cities and neighborhoods. How does underproduction play out in equity, in racial equity, in economic equity, in sort of the patterns of residential segregation, and especially in what access people have to higher opportunity communities?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I think you're exactly right to highlight how it's not just at the state level, but when you get into the nuance of communities and how, where people are able to live based on how much housing is produced has real impacts that really influence people's life outcomes. So at Opportunity Insights, a lot of our research was on the impact of neighborhoods and actually being able to show that based on where you grow up, you can have a very causal impact on your long-term outcomes. And I think we're all aware, and there's been great conversations recently about how things like restrictive zoning, right, their foundation was in trying to keep African Americans and other minorities out of more affluent communities, opportunity-rich communities. And we see that, again, housing underproduction exacerbates those historic legacies. One thing that we can see also is that in the affordable housing world, resources like housing choice vouchers, LIHTC, resources that are extremely important for low-income families, families who actually have access to those resources, they're concentrated in high-poverty areas, even more so than lower-income families who don't have access to those same subsidies. You can see that, right, this underproduction, these tight housing markets exacerbate segregation and these histories. And then the data shows us that it's not just a justice issue, it's not just an issue of fairness, but kids who grow up in these higher poverty areas, right, they're gonna have much worse outcomes in the long term. So I think housing underproduction is exacerbating this. Actually producing more cannot just be an issue of brick and mortar units, but can actually be an engine of economic opportunity for millions of families across the country.
And I'd love for you to expand a little bit more on the issue with kids, because I think part of, those of us who are in this room do not need to be convinced that underproduction is a problem, that high housing prices are a problem. But I think to make the case to sort of the median voter, we need to explain why a suburban homeowner who is financially fairly comfortable and likes their neighborhood, why do you need to care? Why do you need to get engaged, right? And to me, one of the most compelling reasons is we got a bunch of kids who can't access high opportunity neighborhoods, and that has repercussions for the entire society. So talk a little bit more about sort of what you guys found on, sort of what are the impacts of kids in growing up in neighborhoods with more opportunity versus less?
So I think, for folks who are in this space, I think it's intuitive that neighborhoods impact your long-term outcomes, that neighborhoods really matter. But part of what we were able to do is using IRS and Census Bureau data actually track the outcomes of children growing up in every neighborhood across the country. And through the research showing that the same child in the same economic circumstances, based on where they grow up, will have very different outcomes. And I'll do a plug for my old team, the Opportunity Atlas used in the Housing Underproduction report, opportunityatlas.org. You can actually look for every census tract in the country and see what these outcomes look like for different kids. And so you can really see, on the negative side, right, families who are basically stuck in this intergenerational cycle of poverty, but you can actually then pinpoint those areas that when folks have access to these places, they can actually serve as springboards for mobility. So I think, having this data about the actual housing production numbers paired with data like the Opportunity Atlas can actually show us pathways forward to both, help us think about housing, but also using housing as a tool to create access for all.
Coming back down the road this direction, Len, we haven't also gotten into the other hot button issue of the housing finance world at the moment, which is what's happening to interest rates. So the CPI numbers came out yesterday that suggest that probably there's still upwards pressure on inflation. We might expect the Fed to continue raising interest rates. We know that interest rates directly have an impact on the ability of people to buy homes in the owner-occupied market, right? One of my favorite stats from the Joint Center's new report this year, the State of the Nation's Housing, they said that as of April 2021, you would need an income of about $80,000 a year to pay for the median priced home in the US. As of April 2022, you would need an income of about $106,000 a year to pay for the median home in the US. So a $26,000 increase in annual income to pay for the median priced home, right? And that's prices going up, but that's also interest rates going up to buy for the same home, right? I don't know about you guys, I didn't get a $26,000 raise this year. I think most of us didn't, right? So on the owner-occupied side, we know that this is a real squeeze, but we don't want to think about owner-occupied housing and rental housing as totally separate markets. They actually interact. What's happening to the rental market as housing prices and interest rates are going up?
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. Why I'd like to see that this report took a very broad perspective on housing, not just segment the single-family side or the multifamily side. They interact together, and we're at the point where housing was massively undersupplied, and so you see this pressure on house prices and rents. And now we've seen not unprecedented, but 40 years it's been since we've seen interest rates rise as rapidly as they have in the United States. At Freddie, we run a mortgage rate survey every week looking at rates. We're up over 2 percentage points, 2.5 percentage points from a year ago. And that's, you cited some numbers for April. Unfortunately, it's just gotten much, much worse since, because we're in July and the rates are, there's a lot of volatility. They're blipping up and down, but the general pressure has been up. And what does that do? That immediately makes housing a lot less affordable for prospective buyers. But existing homeowners are somewhat insulated, right? Because they've locked in a fixed rate mortgage by the vast majority. But what about renters, right? And what about prospective first-time buyers that now find that they cannot afford? So many, potential homeowners that were thinking, maybe I want to buy, maybe this spring I wasn't quite sure and I waited into summer or next year. they're going to find that it's just not going to work for them because the costs have moved up so significantly, so quickly. And what do they then do? Well, there's a lot of folks that would be those first-time buyers, right? They're going to be in the rental market. And so we see the rents are already, rising well above wages and income, and so that pressure on the rental market just gets tighter. And so there's no sort of out, right? And so that's going to just keep putting pressure until we get more supply longer term. And unfortunately, it looks like there's a possibility that interest rates go up even more, which is going to put even more pressure there. And you think about the equity issues, that's not going to equally impact everyone because a lot of homeowners already have locked in. The folks that are really looking to move to new opportunities, those are the folks that are going to get constrained because if you're trying to move, right, to a potential place, then you have to buy in at a high rate, and so you may stay in your existing home because you've locked in 2.5%, 3% mortgage, and that's going to create some constrictions there. So it's just it's a really tough environment. I'll look for when we get to some solutions, but it's just the economic circumstances are really tough where we are right now, and it's affecting both homeowners and renters. I think Jenny, you had a great point that everyone looks at sort of, well, interest rates are up, that may cool the single family market or owner market. Maybe house price growth moderates, although prices are going up about 17% nationally in recent data. So even a big moderation is going to take a lot to get that back down to in line with income growth. But even if that were to happen, you still have the rental market. And there's not much prospect of rent really easing if you have this tremendous demand and such limited supply.
Yeah. Carlos, we're going to turn to solutions. We're going to fix all of this by the end of our 25 minutes because you're sitting next to me. So Jared Bernstein teed off some of the things that the administration is doing, right? And for those of you who haven't seen, I think it was maybe about a month or two ago, the administration put out this housing supply action plan, right? This has been a consistent theme. But I want to talk a little bit about the specific tools that they are using or proposing to use, and what we think, how effective those are, whether these are the right tools, the kinds of tools. So two of the ones that he mentioned in particular was the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, or EJA, as our transportation colleagues like to call it. So the Federal Department of Transportation now has these competitive pots of money that they can give out to local governments with some strings attached. The other one he called out was the Economic Development Administration, which also provides, typically not so much focused on housing, but on jobs and economic development. Talk a little bit about the kinds of tools the federal government has to incentivize local governments to change their zoning, and whether you think these are the kinds of tools that are likely to be effective.
Right. And it's important to feed off that last point, right? So let's put this into context, what the federal government can do versus what it can't do and what is actually needs to be worked out at the grassroots in the local communities and some cases counties and states. So in the federal government, we could call all of these a range of carrots to sticks, right? And all of these tools, all these policy levers can become sticks at some point, right? So let's talk about the obvious one, which is the money, the purse strings. And so IIJA, I prefer to call it that way too, rather than the typical DC modifier, is a good pot of money. It's a modest pot of money when you're looking at the range of communities and the amount of housing that needs to be produced in this country. So it's a helpful tool. Let's be honest, there's already been reaction from states on the formula side and in some cases on the competitive side around this, referring to any incentives, which these are carrots, they're modest carrots, right? Incentives to improve your zoning, to build more affordable housing, to think about those linkages better. Including governors who've signed the letter saying that it's social engineering. So we have to be, including a governor who has built prisons with her American Rescue Plan money. So we have to be conscious of whether these monies, how effective these modest carrots are going to be.
And just to clarify, so the way the carrots work is that states and localities can apply for funding for the federal government to do a specific project they want to do. The federal government says, we will give you a higher score, and you're more likely to get that money if you change your zoning and land use. But the reason it's a carrot is that it's something that they are asking for. It's not taking away the money that they already have.
Right. And obviously the administration has tried to encourage on the formula side of funds, giving TA, showing best practices, et cetera. And certainly should be lauded for trying to push on that side of it. So that's just one, right? I think that's the obvious one we always talk about, that the money comes in. Let's not forget, federal government has a lot of property. So especially in my world, a lot of coastal property, a lot of riverine property is actually owned by the Army Corps of Engineers, and all the infrastructure that's built on it is owned. So there are ways that we can encourage certain kinds of development with that infrastructure investment. And certainly a lot of that got funded from the IIJA. Federal government has a lot of programs. We've talked about the GSEs, and certainly FHFA has been looking at the risk to federal coffers. This is a conversation that's going on with the National Flood Insurance Program as well. So whether the federal government gets charged with encouraging development in bad places, to use your analogy. So we should be conscious of those levers that can be manipulated in ways that encourage more housing and more housing in the right places. I think it's also important to think about the regulatory powers that the federal government does have that affect local places. Number one, we have environmental levers. Okay, asterisk around SCOTUS decision a week ago about what the balance between legislature and executive of what can be regulated, but certainly there are major programs, major opportunities to think about using that regulatory power to encourage the right kinds of housing.
Can I actually ask there, so let's assume EPA still has its full powers. I can see how the EPA can say you can't develop in environmentally sensitive areas. Can the EPA mandate higher density development in safer areas?
It can't mandate certain kinds of development, right? That's beyond the executive, federal executive ability.
So there are limits to how much it can push on the positive side of production.
That's exactly right. But then we think about other regulatory powers like fair housing, which should be invested in heavily to ensure that the right kinds of income levels and races are mixed in communities. And so there's a variety of levers I think that we should be investing in much more. Okay. So that was 3 areas. I think there's one more I want to point out too. Let's not forget federal government taxes people's incomes. And we forget that mortgage interest deductions, things like that, but certainly corporate tax rates that will provide the demand side assistance that we need to ensure that our communities are inclusive of all people can be encouraged as well.
Great. So I'm going to use that to segue to Lynn and think more on what the private sector side can do. So the GSEs, FHFA, and then just private mortgage lenders. What can the housing finance industry in particular do to address underproduction? And maybe what can it not do?
Yeah, so it wouldn't be appropriate for me as a GSC representative of Freddie to talk about specific policies, but I can talk about sort of what are some of the possibilities around finance and where there are some potential areas. Dr. Bernstein mentioned some of them in his remarks, but I want to reiterate some of those. So I want to talk about actually two big areas where I think that I can offer some perspective on this. So one, in terms of just the financing side, as I alluded to in my remarks, and we all know if the headlines, cost pressures are enormous on potential both homeowners and renters, and so things that can help to reduce financing costs, while they won't solve the underproduction issue, they can at least help to alleviate some of the pressures we're facing in the short term and allow us to bridge to where we can come up with whatever solutions we settle on. And so reducing those costs can come in a variety of ways. New programs that can support first-time buyers, those types of things, but also, as Dr. Bernstein mentioned, manufactured housing, right? And so the development of sort of streamlined products that can be standardized is a big area of focus at Freddie Mac and the GSEs, and trying to think about how we can work with the manufactured housing community to help produce more manufactured housing and help get the financing costs down on that by getting standardized products that can connect with investors can really help to reduce some of those costs, because the gap still is pretty substantial between manufactured housing and site-built homes. So that can help on the margins there. You can also do other variety of other programs around standardization. Lenders, of course, are facing an enormous cost crunch. They've been, relying on, refinance volumes, which have been very high, record highs the last couple of years. Now, if they will, survive, they're going to need to cater to, serve a purchase market. And so having the right products in place for that. And I think the underproduction report highlights this. It's not just a sort of monolithic type of housing that we need. We need a broad variety of housing. And so the financing solutions for those different types of housing may not be the standards of the past, right? And so we have to be flexible in our thinking and being able to understand sort of the nuances of how to lower the cost for all those different types of housing. And so that brings me to my second point, which is around research. And so reports like this underproduction report are really important in helping getting in front of folks and analysts and folks that are thinking about this, sort of to understand the issues that are facing it and potential solutions, and then to start to think through, well, if this is the way that policymakers decide is appropriate, what would be the best kind of policy, or from a business side that could support that. And just general research as well. So I'm really looking forward to future iterations of this report, but other research that that Freddie and folks work on to try to help provide information and get data and give us more awareness about what is going on, and also then get that awareness to actual consumers, right? So you think about climate risk, one of the areas where you can potentially make an impact is helping potential homeowners understand the risks that potentially that they're facing. And we've done some research on that, continuing. We're standing up groups to really help us understand the risks facing the mortgage finance industry and homeowners and renters, and being able to give that information out to the public so people can more accurately assess some of these big and growing challenges which are new.
And I want to ask specifically about sort of the financing status for what we might call gentle density or missing middle, right? So a lot of the state and local zoning reforms that we've seen recently are focused on allowing ADUs, allowing duplexes, triplexes, quads. These aren't a big part of our housing production, right? So we have a housing finance system that knows how to finance and build single-family detached homes and subdivisions and large multifamily buildings. These sort of smaller units, how much more complicated is it to get construction financing? Some of these like duplexes and ADUs are being marketed as somebody who lives in a single family house can build an ADU and bring in rental income that way, right? But you're asking then homeowners to, in some sense, become developers, right? Or convert your single family house to a duplex. How complicated is it for a homeowner to get that kind of financing and do that development? Is there also a space for maybe smaller developers who specialize in building that and then selling the completed product to either a homeowner or an investor?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of potential there, and it's something that folks are very looking at keenly. We published at Freddie, we published a study a year or two ago looking at ADU, and we had analyzed sort of the rise of them. And in many of the places where the underproduction is most acute, you see ADUs been rising in popularity, particularly out west, and there are different types. We had a typology of ADUs, and looking at that. After we published that report out there, we also talked a lot with our internally around sort of from a risk management perspective, from a financing perspective, how do we think about the income from an ADU? How do we think about it from an underwriting and a risk management perspective? That's ongoing and continuing to go. We're trying to get the data to analyze that and understand better sort of who owns an ADU. It's not easy to clearly identify which properties even have them. So being able to just understand that better when you're looking at the collateral is an ongoing effort, and I think that's a promising area and thing that we're going to continue to look at and study and get a better sense, because I think as that's rising, as folks are facing these cost pressures and seeing that as one area that potentially fill in this underproduction, there's going to be more and more need for the financing for that.
David, one of the things that Jared Bernstein brought up was that the sort of market rate housing, maybe the top half of the income distribution, we kind of expect that the market can afford to build this, right? That the rents or prices will cover construction costs, but there's been an even longer shortage of low-income housing, right? So people in the bottom half of the income distribution don't have enough income to cover particularly the cost of new construction. What are some of the potential roles of housing subsidies, either things like the low-income housing tax credit program or household-based subsidies like vouchers? Where do you see those playing into the production conversation?
Yeah. So I think especially something like the Housing Choice Voucher, I think is a really complementary tool to this broader conversation. So Housing Choice Vouchers, they're rental subsidies provided by the federal government, by HUD, and they basically allow families, individual households, to use a subsidy, their voucher, on the private market. And so that they're only paying up to a third of their income, and then the government pays the rest. And so I think this is a tool, again, that in theory should empower families to be able to choose wherever they want to live in the private market. I think families oftentimes face discrimination in the market. Landlords don't want to deal with red tape of the actual housing authorities. And obviously, when you're in a tighter market, that makes it even harder for these families to leverage these kinds of resources. But when you do have reasonably priced market rate housing, it allows you to use a flexible tool like the voucher to, again, create access for all of these families. So I think, when you're able to, create more housing, create more reasonably priced housing, and not just have to build deeply affordable housing that can really, take much longer. There's much more planning behind that. I think being able to leverage tools like the voucher can, I think, really play into making reasonably priced housing a tool for equity. And so I think that's one tool, if we can expand the Housing Choice Voucher Program, cut down on some of that red tape, and also make sure that the payments the government provides are matching those payments in these higher opportunity areas as well. Again, I think that flexibility and empowering individual families can really play into making market rate housing an actual tool for equity as well.
So Carlos, you had mentioned briefly before the issue of technical assistance, and I want to come back to that. So, the federal, whether we use carrots or sticks or regulatory authority, the federal government can nudge local governments to change their rules around zoning or environmental protection or building codes. But ultimately, it's up to local governments to rewrite the rules, right? They're the ones who write and implement this stuff. We have, 3,000 counties and 40,000 incorporated cities and towns across the US. They vary from, New York City, which has an army of staff to do this, to a lot of towns and counties that have fewer than 5,000 people, and, their housing department is one person. How do we expect local governments, with this sort of enormous range of staff resources and capacity and budgets, how do we expect them to respond, to know what are the right regulatory changes they should make? Are there process changes? Are there ways that the federal government or state governments can support local governments to get to better regulations?
So critical to think about the capacity of local governments. And when I say local governments, it's also sort of the soup, the milieu, the intellectual, political, and financial capital that is needed at the local level. So it's partially local government, civic organizations that can push. We've seen this play out in certain places in the YIMBY community. Certainly there's opportunities to build that capacity as well. I hate to pose more problems than solutions, but I mean, the problem is much starker than we can even imagine, right? I was just in New Orleans a month ago, meeting with the hazard mitigation manager for the entire city and parish of New Orleans, thinking that the years that I had been working with him on research projects, he had a whole crew of people. There were 2 people in the hazard mitigation office for the entire parish of New Orleans.
And New Orleans has a lot of hazards to deal with.
Has a lot of hazards, as we know, and also has a lot of resources that have come from the federal and state coffers to improve its mitigation offices. So there's a big issue there. One is the financial resources, giving capacity for hiring staff rather than just giving project-based funding, right? Thinking about using our block grants more efficiently in that way to help build that capacity. Having grant programs for local civic organizations to be sure that they have the capacity to be able to help build that intellectual capital that pushes the local governments to perform better, right? And there are little tweaks I think that we could do. We could think about, with federal government, changing the eligibility definitions for entities to have more local neighborhoods be able to apply. Local governmental entities apply to programs. Thinking about sort of building in TA in the grant programs. There are great examples that are out there now. FEMA's new Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities program has extensive TA as part of the application process. HUD's past National Disaster Resilience Competition actually required TA steps during the process. So you're making sure that those communities can build local engagement and buy-in, as well as produce really good applications that get the money.
David, we haven't actually talked a ton about the politics of building housing on the local level. We often think of sort of NIMBYs who oppose housing. The kind of stereotypical image is an affluent white homeowner, longtime homeowner who's been in a community for a long time, who gets all riled up at the thought of additional housing being built. But we have also seen pushback in some low-income Black and brown neighborhoods, particularly around market rate housing coming in and fears of displacement. You have worked in Detroit, which is one of the cities that has sort of gone from having a lot of excess housing to now facing some pressures. What are the kind of the local politics of development, market rate development in a city like Detroit, and how do you see sort of more market rate production and displacement being related?
No, it's a great question, and it's a tricky one. But I think there's been some great research, especially recently, showing that most likely producing more housing is not the culprit of rising rents and potentially of displacement. But I think a really important point is that despite some of that research, it doesn't mean that local community leaders don't need to really engage with community, especially communities who have been overlooked and disinvested in for decades, right? And I think kind of Carlos talking about capacity building locally. I mean, I'm a huge proponent, and I hope this is in that kind of solution side of thoughtful, comprehensive planning. And I think this report, again, it's showing it's not just about building units, but building housing for a real purpose, right? So increasing access to opportunity, increasing access to jobs and transit. And so part of what we did in Detroit was, we were really trying to rebuild the physical infrastructure of the city after 50 years of depopulation and disinvestment. And so trying to use our limited resources to rebuild sustainable communities in our strongest corridors, right? And really having an equity lens with that. But I think because we were able to think from a holistic perspective, every individual project didn't have to be everything to everyone. Because especially in places like Detroit, there's a very real need for deeply affordable housing. But you can't put that into every single project. So I think having a bigger vision of, we want to create housing at all these different levels. Here's how we do this across the city, and we'll make sure that each project fits into that framework, I think can hopefully help mitigate some of the controversy you get on that project by project level. Because I think if there isn't that bigger plan, then people really are going to fight for anything they can get for every single deal. But I think hopefully that planning process, when you have the capacity to actually do it, can I think help facilitate those conversations into more productive processes. But it's always tricky when you get down to that local level.
Yeah. I mean, it sounds like also some of this is about communication between local elected leaders, local civic leaders, and the communities they're talking with, to trust that we're going to build market rate housing here and deeply affordable housing here and some mixed income housing. There's a plan, like we've thought about this, right? And we're building in the additional infrastructure, we're addressing concerns that long-term residents have. You have to have local leaders who communicate this clearly with their constituents and are believed and trusted, right? And in many communities, that trust is not there. So we have a few more minutes, but I'd like to encourage you to write your questions on the index cards, same thing as before, write them and then hold them up and somebody will come pick them up. Len, I want to pick up one other kind of area that's maybe a little bit niche on the financing. Most of what we've been talking about is sort of production of new housing, right? But one of the three categories we saw before is uninhabitable housing, right? And our housing stock is the oldest it's ever been, right? We are not tearing down and replacing old houses with new houses. We're not adding a lot of new housing. We have a lot of really old housing, some of which is uninhabitable, much of which is inhabited but not in great shape, right? Probably not up to modern energy efficiency codes, often has pretty high operating costs, both owner-occupied housing where the maintenance is expensive, rental housing where it's expensive for landlords because they're constantly fixing things. Talk a little bit about the sort of the financing options for investing in the quality of existing homes. How do either smaller landlords in particular or homeowners access funds if they want to weatherize the house, replace the windows and doors, if they have roof leaks, major systems that need to be upgraded? How complicated is it to access funding for that? And particularly thinking about sort of the landlords and homeowners who have less resources.
Yeah, I think that's a big part of this, because you see in many parts of the country, the housing stock, like Detroit, it was the example we saw earlier, where there's many of the units that are just uninhabitable. At the same time, you have a dearth of newly built entry-level housing, right? First-time home buyers. While we're seeing very large numbers of first-time home buyers, just given our population, we're not building new housing largely that would meet their needs. So there's a potential of remedy there in the sense that if you could, match up those first-time buyers with those housing and provide funds for renovation when they actually purchase the home. And there are programs that exist in that can offer that potential, right? So that your buyer can provide some sweat equity that can help them to make the purchase of the home and do that improvement. And then you've improved a home, added, to the housing stock overall because you've reduced some of the uninhabitable homes, and you've helped a first-time home buyer begin on the housing, home ownership, which they might not be able to given the cost of any of the other home, new homes certainly, or other, for-sale homes in the marketplace there.
Great. So I'm going to do a lightning round and give you guys a chance to say if there is either policy solution or business solution that we haven't talked about yet that you think should be on the radar. We're talking mostly to kind of a federal audience today, but I'll let you for this one bring in also kind of state and local. Is there something that policymakers, that business entities, that civic groups should be doing to fix underproduction that we haven't talked about yet today? Carlos?
Why me first again? Gosh, there's so much. So we've talked about where we should build, and it's also important to remember where we have built and make sure I think a comment that you made, that these things do not exist in vacuums, right? So thinking about communities that already exist and how we have built in those places, I think is also important. And so thinking when we're growing, we're also thinking about all of the quality of the building and relationship to the quality of the past building. I do want to note IAJA did include a major investment in weatherization, which is the only direct housing funding that came out of the IAJA. And so ideally in the next week or two, we'll be hearing about other potential ways to intervene in existing housing through energy retrofits coming out of the legislature. But it's certainly important to remember how we build as much as where we build.
I won't tell anybody what they should do, though. I highly recommend that you read this Housing Underproduction report and other research out there.
Always good.
That's a cop-out.
Very diplomatic.
Yeah.
Well, we can always invest in more funding. I mean, I think actually, your point to more research and more data, the housing sector is not as meticulously tracked in real time as, say, labor markets. So, we have this report coming out on housing underproduction. The data go up through 2019, and we've just lived through 2.5 years of really unprecedented times, right? I mean, we have monthly jobs day, we have, reports coming out on the labor market. We don't have real-time data on the housing market, and especially on the rental market, right? So we're asking policymakers to make forward-looking policies with backward-looking data.
So one thing I would say is finding creative ways to support smaller minority developers who really have a pulse on the local communities. I think they're very well positioned to actually kind of create that missing middle in communities that I think can really be a huge boon when we're talking about creating more housing in communities that really need it.
And I think we've got people here from the Home Builders and National Multifamily Housing Council who are aware of this. And in addition, that 50% of your labor force is women, and the construction industry could tap into that a little more.
Absolutely.
Great. So we are ready to go to the Q&A portion.
First question, what's the most overrated pro-housing policy that's being pursued today?
Oh, who wants to tackle that? I'm actually okay taking a first cut at that one. I'm going to say that I don't think legalizing ADUs all over the country is going to solve our problem. There's nothing wrong with it. ADUs should be legal, but it takes political capital to do any of the zoning reforms. And California has built a lot more ADUs than I would have expected in the last couple of years, so those can be part of the solution. But to the extent that you're not going to get that many shots at asking for zoning reform, I don't know that ADUs would be my top priority.
Maybe I'll take a positive spin on the question. I think, I already mentioned housing choice vouchers, but I think kind of instead of mandating affordability through different regulations or rules, expanding programs like the housing choice voucher program that can kind of create that flexibility to afford more deeply affordable housing in market rate housing, I think is a nice kind of way to kind of work around those mandates that could have backlash and kind of make housing less affordable overall.
Okay. The report does a good job at showing the cumulative shortage of housing, but it is also critically important for policymakers to understand how that shortage impacts households at various income levels. For example, the shortage of rental housing primarily stems from the shortage for extremely low-income residents. Will zoning changes be enough to address the market failure? If not, what solutions are needed specifically for the extremely low-income population?
I'd say no, they're not enough, right? I think maybe one way to think about this, I mean, we are concerned about particularly disinvested communities of poverty and communities of color that have been denied resources in the past, raising their eyebrows whenever they hear about growth. I mean, this is the history of this country, is that growth rhetoric tends to benefit white, wealthy people and not poor brown people. So my concern is that we need to think about the broad range of demand issues, making sure that there is the assistance for the extremely low-income households that need to be able to access this growth, so that this growth isn't just one-dimensional.
I'll add that no, zoning reform is not going to reach low-income households, and we should think about just giving poor people money. In addition to things like housing vouchers, which are a very, very effective policy tool, things like the expanded child tax credit are a very effective way of just getting extra cash into people's pockets. Low-income households need help paying the rent, but they also need help paying for transportation and healthcare and food and all of the other things. And if we just give them money and let them have flexibility in using their budget, the same way all of us have flexibility to prioritize our needs, that would make a lot of people better off.
Our next question is, we are seeing the direct impacts of this housing crisis with the rise of the unsheltered homeless population. What can we do to provide permanent housing for the most vulnerable populations?
You guys are asking all of the easy questions, right?
Fund it is the first question, right? We need to be investing in, one, the immediate shelter and continuum of care, but we also need to be funding long-term investment in permanent housing in all of these communities where there have been huge spikes in homelessness, which is pretty much most of the country.
And there's a fantastic new book called Homelessness is a Housing Problem by Greg Colborn and Clayton Aldern, I think is the second author. I highly recommend it. They do a really nice job of showing that homelessness has been increasing the most in places that have not been building enough housing. So these are very closely linked problems.
What federal policies or laws are hurting housing production and affordability?
I mean, geez, these questions. I mean, there's a potential for any rule to be both an obstacle to development and a catalyst for good development. So I don't think I could pick one federal. I mean, certainly in the world that I work in, there have been a lot of claims that it's environmental regulation that is a barrier to development. But we've seen since the 1960s, since Clean Water Act and Clean Air Act, is that places that benefited the most actually had amazing amounts of growth in both housing and economic development. So I wouldn't say that. I would say that that's probably, I'm going to mix two questions. That's the most overrated barrier or problem. I don't want to expand on others because we can go through a whole thesis here.
Yeah, I mean, we're focusing on the federal side of solutions, but I think it's really important to underscore that the regulations that are making it hard to build housing are mostly adopted and enforced at the local level and some at the state level, right? So, NEPA is probably not the problem, right? I mean, looking across the country, everybody is subject to NEPA. That's not the difference between places that build and don't, but it's hard to look at California and say that CEQA is not part of the problem.
Yeah. I think maybe just kind of one point to that too is, again, thinking more critically about geography. And I think, like the housing report mentioned, how we're building housing in ways that really increases access and opportunity. And so programs like low-income housing tax credit, programs like the housing choice voucher, really making sure that the incentives are not just helping produce or helping kind of create access, but where we're creating access in ways that kind of really gives families better life outcomes, increases their access to jobs. So kind of making sure that these policies are calibrated in the right ways to interact with local policies and regulations to make sure that they're kind of serving their intended purpose.
If we could waive federally subsidized housing from zoning, so you could build tax credit projects and just bypass local zoning, that would be super helpful. But I'm pretty sure that lawyers will tell me that that's not possible to do.
These are great questions.
State and local fiscal recovery funds are the single biggest housing block grant in history. How should state and local governments spend that money on supply? What can folks in this room do to encourage the use of these flexible grants for housing?
So I'll start with a little bit of framing, which is that state and local governments got a lot of money from the recovery, but it's not earmarked necessarily for housing. So the first, I think the first step is for state and local governments to decide housing is a priority and they should spend some of their recovery money on it. To give a plug for my colleagues at Brookings Metro, we're tracking how a lot of places are spending their money, and the biggest thing they've done so far is use it to cover government operations. So to continue paying the salaries for employees, to cover some tax shortfalls that they faced, but sort of just general operational expenses. The second biggest pot of money is going into infrastructure. So housing is getting some of the investment, but we in this room would probably argue that more of those funds should go to housing. And then once you get to the sort of here's how much money we're planning to spend on housing, deciding what to do with it requires a little bit of triage. Is it building supportive housing, deeply affordable housing? Is it using it to build staff capacity to help you do things like make plans for longer term investments that work better, right? And that's going to be a case-by-case basis.
Okay. What makes you optimistic about the future of housing production? What good trends do you, what good trends do we need to invest more time and resources into?
Any of you?
So all of these enormous challenges that we've been talking about with the costs and the rising, rents and home prices, they're very large, right? But nevertheless, we've seen that, there's still been movement, right? I think the report highlighted that from 2018 to 2019, the deficit got a little less big, right? And so there was some movement there. And so construction has been picking up. Now, we'll have to see how sustainable that is given the recent rise in interest rates. But it looks like the, construction levels are starting to reach a point where they may begin to start to bridge this gap. And we're also reaching the point where we still have many millions of millennials, and Gen Zers now coming into the market, but we're reaching the breaking point, right? The crest of that wave is probably a year or two out. And so we may be setting up for a situation where we can start to see relief coming online. It's still probably a year or two away. We'll have to see where the economy is and what happens with interest rates. But I think if we can stay on a path of continued production, that we can start to fill in that gap. It's going to take a while, but I think there's reason to be optimistic that at least we are, we're seeing first-time buyers come in, we're seeing renter households being formed, we're seeing some housing coming online. So if you want to be optimistic, I think there's a case to be made there, and that should actually support the housing market for the next 3 or so years to provide, to give incentives to have that continue to make progress there.
Just to piggyback on that, I mean, the production has been, it's clearly been happening in the last 2 years where we've seen that upswing. That may not be in the report, and it's been happening in all sectors, so multifamily in particular, as well as retrofitting and remodeling has had massive growth in the last 2 years. So there is some sense of positivity around that. I would say what makes me, it's a weird way to answer the question, which is a good question. What makes me optimistic is that we're at a crisis point, and unfortunately, humans have a tendency only to act when there's crisis, which is a negative thing. So I'd say hopefully crisis will make us act.
You mentioned earlier how NIMBYism can sometimes create interesting political bedfellows, but I think what makes me optimistic is that this can really be a bipartisan issue moving forward on the housing production front, right? I think especially when you include that equity lens, right? This is not a Democrat or Republican issue. I think we all know we need more housing, and we can create it in very thoughtful ways that I think help everybody across the political spectrum. So I think, one, with that crisis point, I think this is an issue that I think people across the political spectrum can really come behind and try and find thoughtful, realistic solutions.
Yeah, I love that, and I'll point out that if you look at the states that have been leaning into more zoning reform, the states that are newly expensive and aware of this as a problem, it crosses the political spectrum, right? So places like Utah that are traditionally small government red states are very worried about what this does to their economic competitiveness as a state, right? Texas and Nebraska have been talking about things like shot clocks and some of those sort of more modest reforms, right? Business-friendly states are leaning into this, and we see places like Oregon, places like Massachusetts, I mean, Massachusetts is a great example. You have a Democratic legislature and a Republican governor that passed a really ambitious and aggressive statewide zoning reform focused around transient-oriented development, right? So in a time when there's not a lot of bipartisan cooperation, this is an area where we could make some progress.
Sorry. Black-white homeownership gap is the highest in 120 years. Access to mortgages is blocked by 1, lack of wealth, and 2, racialized lower credit scores. Any promising solutions for increasing access to mortgages for Black Americans?
Len, do you want to take that? Do you want to talk about maybe some of the changes in things like credit scoring and use of alternative credit measures?
Well,
Or not?
there's, I'm not an expert on the credit scoring, so I want to be careful on that. But no, it is a major issue, and it's a focus. You know, the GSEs have released their equity plans, and they're focusing on it and trying to bridge this gap because, you know, since we saw it in the chart, right? Since 2010, you know, the progress that Black Americans have made in terms of home ownership has declined, actually, since the year 2000, I believe, was in that chart, right? And you saw that. And so filling that in, trying to find ways that we can make, you know, more lower cost financing available to those communities is incredibly important, and it's something that, you know, the GSCs are focused on through these plans. We're going to have to, you know, they just came out this past year, so we'll have to see how well we execute against that. But that's going to is a top priority. You know, the FHFA has stressed that, and so the GSCs are going to be focused on that. You know, Freddie, I know a lot of folks are looking into that, seeing what we can do, but it's a tough challenge, and unfortunately, progress has not been great over the last, you know, decade.
Investment in pre-purchase home counseling and financial literacy preparation programs, et cetera, certainly has to be massively expanded for people of color, potential buyers of color. But I'll reference another colleague of ours, Andre Perry, to talk about the importance of making sure that the professionals that are behind these decisions, that the lenders, the realtors, the appraisers, are people of color as well, and can help mediate some of the needs of their communities.
This will be our last question. I think it'll bring us back a little bit to the report. What factors within high opportunity census tracts contribute the most to driving positive outcomes for residents, e.g. schools, parks, income, et cetera?
I can hit on that one a little bit. So it's interesting. So I think lower poverty rates, you know, high proportion of middle income families, which I think speaks to just having really diverse communities. There was one really interesting kind of statistic in the work that we did at Opportunity Insights. It was, so specifically in neighborhoods that have a higher proportion of Black fathers present, all the young Black men who grew up in the neighborhood on average have better outcomes. And I think that really speaks to being in a place where you can see people who reflect your reality, you know, going on to college, having good careers. So I think, you know, communities that one where it's just, where they're diverse, you see role models and you see those pathways to successful careers, I think is extremely important. And also building that social capital, right? So building places where you actually see relationships being built across lines of race and class, I think can have very tangible outcomes. So diverse communities and communities where, you know, there's real relationships forming, I think are central to thinking about how we build strong places.
Well, thank you very much. We're out of time, but join me in thanking the panelists.
All right, let's give another round of applause to Lynn Kiefer, Carlos Martin, David Williams, and our moderator, Jenny Schutz, for that great discussion. As we prepare to close our program, I want to take one last opportunity to thank our presenting sponsor, Amazon Housing Equity Fund, as well as our champion sponsor, Walton Family Foundation. I'd also like to thank all of our speakers and panelists for being so generous with their time and expertise today, not only with the hard work that went into speaking and presenting all of this information, but also analyzing and validating our report. I'd also like to express sincere appreciation for Leah MacArthur, our Chief Operating Officer, as well as an outstanding group of partners in this room who made this all possible. So thank you very much. Give everyone a round of applause. And Finally, I'd like to thank our Board of Directors and Advisory Council, whose leadership continues to propel our mission with the goal of forging policies and partnerships to achieve housing equity, eliminate systemic barriers, and create more homes. My hope is that by accurately defining the problem and proposing common sense solutions today, we have presented a plan for addressing housing underproduction across the U.S. We believe that our policy framework, A Better Foundation, is the type of highly customizable approach to housing production that will help policymakers and planners pinpoint the places where building the most housing can drive economic, fiscal, and equitable outcomes. To that end, I hope everyone here today found some information or heard some insight that will help us build a better foundation for confronting one of the most urgent issues of our time. Solving our nation's housing challenge, our pervasive, severe, and growing underproduction, will take commitment, collaboration, and no shortage of political will. By working together, I am optimistic that we can find the solutions our communities need to address this unprecedented economic, environmental, and racial equity crisis. Thank you so much, and until next time, appreciate your engagement. Take care.